It's like, wow, this is interesting. Like, people are talking about this song right now. They're talking about The Pool. I think it's definitely inspired by him. I'm just going to share that video and be like, let's give The Pool credit. The man you just saw in that video is synth extraordinaire Patrick S. Keel, aka The Pool. You might have noticed the song he was playing, Jamaica Resting, sounds a lot like LCD Soundsystem's Dance Yourself Clean, their biggest song. I decided to take that video of The Pool and post it to my Musically Proper Instagram account and make the claim that LCD Soundsystem was inspired by The Pool and never gave him credit, and that The Pool deserves all the credit for playing a part in making one of the best dance songs of the 2010s. Never did I think that post would go viral, but I'm so grateful that so many people have fallen in love with The Pool's music and want to learn more about him. Patrick Keel passed away in 2017, but his debut album is available digitally thanks to a man by the name of Darren Bergstein. I'll let Darren introduce himself here in a minute, but I just want to say thank you for tuning into the interview. My name is Justin, and welcome to Musically Proper. As I understand it, you were the first person to reissue The Pool's music, right?
Correct.
Okay, that's great. I think that makes you definitely one of the experts that we could come to.
Well, yes and no, but we can get to that.
Before we talk specifically about The Pool, Darren, could you tell us about your musical background?
So I have basically operated as the best way to describe as a multi-hyphenate in the industry for probably most of the last 30 to 40 years. In love with the whole idea of electronic music since I was 13 years old, since I first heard Tangerine Dream's Force Majeure. It's pretty much been my passion and my involvement for most of my life. I have a CD library of over 35,000 CDs. I used to have 50,000, but I've slimmed down a little bit over the years. 90% of that is in the electronic and experimental realm. I've known and interviewed many of the large figures in the genre over the years, including Edgar Froese from Tangerine Dream. Mm-hmm. Hans Joachim Rodelius, who of course was half of Cluster. I actually put him and his late partner Mobius up in my house when I was living in Oregon when they were doing their first American tour back in the 90s. I've interviewed Klaus Schultz. I've pretty much been around.
Let's jump to The Pool then. Do you remember the first time you came across his music?
I do. So I used to live in Arizona, and there's a record chain out there called Zia Records, Z-I-A. Still there, but a little bit different in complexion than it was back then. And I'm looking in the record bins, and we're talking, mid-'80s, I guess. And I come across his first EP. And that was that the Dances Down EP? I don't remember. I don't have the vinyl anymore. I sold it to a friend a long time ago. But it was the first EP, and then having loved Jamaica Resting and the other tracks on it, then I think a short time later he self-released 333, and I snapped it up immediately. And I just remember being just blown away by it. There was just something about the textures he created, and the fact that he was kind of straddling. There was elements of synth pop on it, but there was also atmospheric, pre-ambient, proto-ambient stuff, and he was experimenting with rhythms. It's really just fascinating. And it became one of those little obscure records that always sat in my library and was always sort of special in that regard because, he was kind of a one-off. He really never followed up, that particular record. So now fast forward across the years, and when I decided to start a record label, there was always a bit of a short list of people that I was saying I would love to reissue or release. And when Anodize kind of became, I wouldn't say it became a reissue label, but I decided to do what I thought was some choice reissues, his name was up there. Somehow I tracked him down. Uh, got a hold of him. We had many phone conversations. He was telling me how he was not in good health. I told him who I was, and I've loved his music for, God, 20, 30 years. And he was very delighted to hear that. And little by little, we worked out that I said I would love to see. I think 333 really should get a bigger audience, especially with what was going on in the early aughts and the resurgence of interest in synth music and electronica. And I don't know, the stars aligned, and we made it happen.
Yeah.
That's pretty
That's
much where it all came from.
that's beautiful. Yeah. Just that you held on to it, and he was on that list when you had the opportunity and it worked out. That's so cool. You did mention on the Bandcamp page where you have 3.3, I think you added a plus to it, 3.3 plus, what you called the reissue. You have a really nice write up there that's full of detail, and you mentioned it was a timely reissue, timely to bring back that album. Was that really just kind of due to what you were saying, just the surge in synth and electronica at the time?
Pretty much. The whole idea of Plus was attaching some of the other tracks that never ended up on 333, specifically the few that were on that EP. And I recall that when we spoke, again, a long time ago, but I said to him, do you really have, and I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, do you have anything unreleased? And he really didn't. To the best of my knowledge, the only stuff that he had like in his vault, if you can even call it that, was that other EP, that other vinyl EP. There really was nothing else. So we were able to cull those tracks off of that and just kind of append it to the record, which is why it's a plus. I mean, I really tried to put pretty much everything he had available onto that CD. Now, maybe there's the stuff lurking back there. Who the hell knows? Especially now that he's deceased. There's no way of knowing. So I really don't know. But that was kind of the objective. Let's just get all his work out there, get it onto compact disc, get it out to a bigger audience. When I said timely, I think for people who really are into electronic music, whether it's my generation or people sort of just discovering over the last 15 or 20 years, there's been an enormous resurgence in synth music pretty much since the early aughts. And it's been great to see the interest spanning time and spanning, both spanning men and women, spanning, transcending the ideas of it being just an offshoot of dance music, or an offshoot of new age, or an offshoot of Teutonica, like Tangerine Dream or Klaus Schultz, pretty much just like dispelling the idea of genre boundaries and people saying, wow, synthesizer music is not just accompanying music. It's not just done for dance. There's a whole wealth of sound here that we can all explore. And it was very exciting in the early aughts up till, and still continuing to this day, of course, what people are doing out there. You get on a typical Bandcamp deep dive, and there's just, you fall into that abyss and there's really no way to come out.
Yeah.
And I do that periodically, and I have to sort of restrain myself because there's just too much. You also understand too, I'm sort of old school that way. I don't download. I don't. I hate Spotify. I'm a physical hard media person, as are all my friends, and which is why I own, as I said, over 35,000 pieces of little silver discs, and before that, of course, was vinyl. And I to me, the legitimization of music is when the statement is made on a physical media. And I know that's a hotly debatable topic that a lot of people will contest. And I have, I listen to downloads. I use Apple Music in my car, but ultimately it's really about the physical product. And that's why I launched my labels. To me, it was the compact disc was going through a little bit of a identity crisis, and of course it's never really recovered, and it's good to see that there are people out there that still continue to produce them, that it's not just become some niche format. To me, it was important to recognize that there is the tactility of an object is important, that not everything should simply be just digital ether. It should be something you could hold and touch and see and read and feel you own a part of. And that's the way it should be with all art. I mean, we can go to a museum and we can see art, but we could also own art. It's not just something you pop up on a screen and set up as a PDF or as an icon on digital wallpaper. And that was also part of the impetus of sort of rescuing Patrick's music, bringing it out to an audience that I thought at that time would hopefully embrace it.
Yeah.
The downside was that the reissue really did not do as well as I had hoped. The sale, I mean, eventually the CDs all sold out. It took a very long time, but all my runs of CDs were very small quantities, 100 or 200, and the timing just was not good, I suppose. The timing was good in terms of people discovering his music. Unfortunately, the timing was not good in terms of the continuing devolvement of the CD as a viable format that people were embracing, so.
Yeah. I mean, it is interesting that you said I was coming back though, because at that time when this came out, I think, cassettes, there were cassette labels like Burger Records that were kind of booming. Vinyl was maybe kind of still having its surge or starting. But yeah, now lately I do see people including CDs a lot, or CD only as the only physical piece. And so I just wanted to throw that in. I think that's pretty cool. Well, another thing too with the track list, you, I don't believe. I love that it's like the most it's the most extensive, piece of work for him. Almost all his songs on there. Jamaica, I noticed Jamaica Running is not on there. Jamaica Resting is. I actually like Resting more. Do you recall not including that one, Jamaica Running?
Oh, okay, so the track list is, I'm actually going to pull out the CD while we're talking. I'm looking on my shelf here. The CD track list is exact to the record.
Okay.
The only time it deviates is after on the air. So the very last track on the original vinyl was On the Air. I'm sorry, no, 333. I'm sorry. And then of course tracks 11 through 16 came off those EPs. I believe Jamaica Running was a sort of an adjunct remix. Now, again,
That's right.
I don't want to be quoted on this. I don't remember, but I pulled off the EP whatever I just happened to have. I mean, whatever tracks were on that EP, we translated and did our best to remaster and put on disc.
Right.
So it might have been that track was not on vinyl, to the best of my knowledge. It might have been a B-side. It might have been a remix somewhere. He did not have any recording of that.
Okay.
Part of the problem was because the fact that he was, kind of medically infirm at that time. He didn't have any access really to, to anything that he had, whether it was multi-track tapes or any kind of archival material. So we had to work with vinyl.
Yeah.
But that's the
Yeah.
reason why, as far as I know. So it's pretty
Okay.
much what you see is what the world saw when those records were first released.
Yeah. Now that's interesting because I think here we can start to talk about influences, possibly, influences on Patrick on the Pool, but also the way his music influenced some later artists, possibly, or even of his era. But I think you're right about Jamaica Running, that it was after Jamaica Resting was kind of I don't know about a remix, but something of that nature, because Dark Entries Records, actually, who has referred me to you
Right.
for
I
an
know. Yeah.
interview.
Right.
Yeah, on the EP they put out, they included that, and I think he mentioned in the write-up that it was sped up just because the music was already hitting dance floors, DJs were liking it, and it was just an option to be out there. And you had mentioned in your write-up that Afrika Bambaataa was playing Dance It Down regularly at NYC dance clubs, Danceteria. And
Correct.
I personally think Patrick was inspired by The Message by Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five for that song, for Place in the Sun. Excuse me, not Dance It Down, but he made a boogie tune called Place in the Sun. It reminds me a lot of The Message, but it's still a fresh take. I think it's great, but there's some nods to the lyrics about going under and your mind might crack, and just really cool. And I'm just curious, knowing that Afrika Bambaataa was playing him, a possible connection to him liking The Message by Grandmaster Flash. Did he ever talk about his appreciation for hip hop?
I think more than anything else, he was, I think, fairly surprised. I mean, look, like all artists, everybody hopes that they're going to achieve some level of recognition in their lifetime, and they're going to hope, they hope. No, nobody wants to release any kind of recording and just, and it appeals to five people. He obviously wanted some degree of recognition. Now, 333, I believe, was issued on Enigma. back then. So he got some degree of, or perhaps picked up and licensed to Enigma. I don't recall, but that obviously brought him to the ears of Bambaataa, who played the record. So the recognition was growing.
Yeah.
But I don't remember actually talking about it in that regard. It was really more, our discussions, I think, really were more that I was completely, I wouldn't say enthralled, but just really fascinated by the fact that he's basically, one-man music machine. And even back then, the whole DIY ethic was still kind of tough to do, mostly because equipment was just simply not that affordable.
Yeah.
No one was going out and buying a synclavier back then. They were $50,000. So, he realized everything he did on fairly minimal equipment, and it was a lot more effective for that reason.
Yeah.
I'm not really sure that he was influenced by hip hop. Patrick was in Texas, and the Austin, Texas scene, I believe he was in Austin, was, God, back then, who the hell knows? Austin always had a very, very healthy experimental music scene. There was a magazine that was published out of there by a guy named Dan Plunkett called ND, which was, short for like indie.
Mm-hmm.
But the magazine really did cover experimental, electronic, noise music, odd, all kinds of like different types of music that were generally not mainstream. And Dan was great, and he used to run a store called 33, and I believe it's called 33 and a Third. And so Austin always had a very healthy scene, but I'm not sure if Patrick felt a part of it or outside of it. And I don't really think he was per se influenced by hip hop. If anything, I think the beats and the rhythms he created was what got everybody's ears burning in the dance clubs. The fact that they latched on to what he was doing. How they discovered it, who knows? When you're asking me about the whole hip hop influence, I think it was really more synchronicity than anything else. It was a matter that Dance It Down got out there. His music somehow found its way, and this, of course, is in the pre-internet days, and it's pretty amazing that it was able to work its way into the clubs and get discovered by, it got more notoriety simply by that fact.
Yeah.
How much that worked in his favor, who knows?
Yeah. No, that's great. I mean, and I think Place in the Sun is kind of like a one-off in his on that whole album. It's a little more boogie. I think his delivery is a little more rapping style. I could be alone in this dance, and I really do. The themes of the message and Place in the Sun are very similar, but and like I said, I think there's some nods and lyrics, but that's just me, as a music fan, kind of reaching and enjoying. It doesn't really matter. I just thought it was interesting, and it's kind of a one-off to me, that song Place in the Sun. But you also talked about instruments and stuff that he was using, and you linked in the Bandcamp, your write-up, you linked to this great piece on YouTube that he recorded for a local Austin channel, I think.
Right.
And he does like 3 songs or so. He's using a Korg Poly 6, from what I can tell. Did he have any sort of favorite instruments? Are there any instruments you could talk about that he used that he kind of maximalized what was possible?
All the credits that are on that Bandcamp page that are also replicated within the CD digipack as well were literally lifted right off of the original 333 LP with certain augmentation from him. Because I had said, so how do you want this credited? What do you want to do? And all the people that were originally instrumental in making the record happen were all needed to be given, replicated credits. So they all got it. And then anything else that he wanted to add as an addendum. But unfortunately, the only other thing that's sort of really discussed is some of the people that helped him out on the record were playing things like emulators, Prophet 5. I do not know what his keyboard arsenal is, and I'm sorry to say, I wish I did. Looking back now, I would have actually loved to have known that myself. He did not make that clear, and at this point, we can only hazard a guess.
Yeah.
Listening to some of those sounds and thinking about the era, it's interesting because even back then, you're talking about, I used to own a Yamaha SY-77, and I remember I bought that around 88, and it was, I think, about 15 or $1,800, and to me, that was like all the money in the world. buying a synthesizer for $1,800. Now you can get you get an app for $100.
Yeah.
But I want to say, thinking about the instrumentation that he used, it wouldn't surprise me if he was using Roland's, possibly some older ARPs, only because those were becoming a little more affordable at the time. But obviously, he also loved Korg products. So the Korg Poly 6 may very well have been his one keyboard of choice. I wish I knew.
Yeah.
In this day and age, if I was releasing it now, or if anybody was releasing it now, they would have said, please send us an equipment list. We just want to know what you're using.
Yeah.
He probably would have done it all on soft synths. I mean, who knows?
Totally.
But the Korg, and trying to think about it, like, for instance, you look at somebody like Gary Newman. Gary Newman loved the old ARP synths, like the ARP 2600, and people like Tony Banks from Genesis loved, they used a lot of different, manufacturers, but they also loved things like the ARPs. And to me, the ARPs really made incredible sounds back then. Even the presets on those keyboards were amazing. So his sounds were fairly unique, and I'm not sure how technologically savvy he was, whether or not he messed around with any of the presets, how much processing he actually did, how much post-production he did. He strikes me as a guy who was fairly savvy, who knew what he was doing and wasn't just improvising. He really had a compositional mean to him that, allowed him to create what he created. And there's definitely, there's not only a deep well of imagination and all that music, but you can see that there's a very considered approach to what he was doing, especially since, a lot of that has to do as well with the mixing, because I think some people might have thought, like, why are you releasing what is essentially a synth pop record? And I said, it's really not a synth pop record. And even though he sings on some tracks, even though he covers Peter Gunn, Heavenly Voices, if you listen to Heavenly Voices now, you're talking about music that was 40 years old, and it still sounds like an amazing lost or lost ambient techno track. He was presaging all of that kind of music. So my roundabout way, I don't know. I would say it's safe to assume that he was probably mostly using the chords, because it shows it in the video, and maybe that's what he could afford at the time. So it's a best guess. It's a best guess.
No, that's great. Yeah, I mean, Heavenly Voices, Uptown Flash, a few of those. I mean, they feel like they could have been blockbuster movie scores. Like they're just so like riveting. I mean, Pool 62 is also beautiful. Doesn't feel as action oriented, but just beautiful songs. And I guess that kind of brings me to one of my questions. Like, he had a label, from what I understand, Dragon Street Records, that he kind of put some younger artists that went on to major labels, Tripping Daisy and some others. Were you familiar with that, or did he ever talk about that?
And I was not aware he had a label. No, I did not know that.
Yeah, so someone had reached out and said, a lot of, he was a music professor. He wasn't, I think he was granted like a certain, it's not emeritus, but he was granted a certain, possibly by the governor at the time, to have to be able to teach music. I think just because he had such an influence in the scene and was liked so well. This is just secondhand. I've heard from someone who was a student, but a lot of students have commented on the video I shared of him taking, they took classes from him, and how incredible he was and how fun he was to work with, and how youthful he was. But and like, one of them mentioned he had a label called Dragon Street Records, had put out some bands from Austin that ended up getting, fairly big. So yeah, super incredible, interesting guy. And okay, so to get to the hot topic, I guess, a lot of people feel that LCD Sound System, really heavily lifted Jamaica Resting for what's their biggest song. And there are Dance Yourself Clean. And there are other people who feel that Dance It Down, that Pet Shop Boys possibly borrowed from that for their biggest song, West End Girls. There's some really strong similarities. I'd say more so in Dance Yourself Clean, but strong similarities in both. I'm guessing you guys didn't talk about those things, but I've read comments on YouTube that him talking about students and people calling him when West End Girls came out and said congrats on the new song and that sort of thing. So I think he was aware of it. And people, the big question I've gotten is, did he get any licensing or any royalties from either of these bands?
I have no idea.
Yeah,
I mean, it's our relationship was just very pleasant, very, very pleasant. We had some really terrific conversations, but but purely business. So I honestly
Yeah.
do not know. And the fact that you're telling me that did LCD do a direct lifting? Is there an actual sample from Dance
Well,
It Down? Because
no.
I'm not aware of that either. I'll be honest, I'm not the biggest LCD fan. I certainly respect what he does.
Hmm.
I think I own maybe one or two albums from LCD. I think I own that 5433, was it like a
4533.
remix disc?
Yeah, I have that as well.
Yeah, right, right. And that's it. I just never really particularly got into what he does. And as far as West End Girls, that's a very interesting. That's the first time I've heard of drawing that parallel between Patrick's music and that. And I think and this is just purely a guess on my part, I I want to say I highly doubt that Neil Tennant was that aware of what Patrick Keel was doing. If anything, it was probably just one of those sort of bits of serendipity that happens. That happens in
Yeah.
art sometimes. Sometimes the influences just sift down through the mind, and whether it's in literature or film or music, and it's not necessarily a ripping off or a sampling or a lifting thereof. It's just kind of like, well, we came up with this riff, and it's just kind of interesting. It bears some similarity. It brings to mind, I don't know how familiar you are with these bands, but it brings to mind Killing Joke was very, I don't know if you remember the band Killing Joke. They were very up in arms when after 80s came out, and Nirvana's Come As You Are basically is the exact same riffs and the same melodies as 80s, just slowed down. And Killing Joke were not very happy about that. And as far as I know, I believe they took them to court. And when you hear both songs, I love both songs. I love Killing Joke. When you hear them, yeah, it is there, but frankly, it's there in the same way that, say, the Jam utilized the bass line for their song "Start" from the Beatles' "Taxman." And there's nothing to say that I think two bands or two artists can't come up with a similar or even quasi-identical riff and sort of call it their own. It really does depend on context. It's not simply a matter of like a hip hop guy just literally lifting, verbatim a sequence of notes and sticking it in their song. And we could talk about my opinion about sampling. We could spend hours talking about that, because I've had very, very strong opinions about that, because to some degree, I get it and I can appreciate it. And then in others, when you basically have no ideas of your own and you lift whole cloth entire pieces of what other people actually achieve through sweating and instrumentation, it becomes kind of a gray area.
Yeah.
West End Girls, a great song that I've always loved, and I don't know. It's funny. I've never really made the connection until you brought it up.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I think it's more serendipity than anything else. I really don't think. I wouldn't even call it homage. I frankly never drew that connection until you mentioned it.
So the way he goes, dance it down in Austin town. Like there's a way that he says town that feels very similar to the way they say West End town.
Right.
And,
Right.
the beats are really similar. And so someone had said that he brought it up in one of his classes, actually. And I think he just laughed about it. Someone had also commented in 1983, Neil Tennant was writing for Smash Hits. He would have had easy exposure to this record. And knowing that it was making the circuits in NYC with, with DJs and dance clubs and stuff, people think it's very possible. But, I love to hear your take on even sampling too. And to the LCD thing, I think when you talk about the sweat and tears, I think that's kind of how people feel about what James Murphy did with Jamaica Resting, because if you listen to Dance Yourself Clean, no, it's not a direct sample, but it's basically recreated. And the beginning, the hand drum part, that's probably been around for ages, right? It's a very simple drum build, but the way he starts to bring in the synths, those chords like dun 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 dun, that is
Right.
completely replicated in Dance Yourself Clean.
Right.
100%. And so, yeah, I think what I had hoped is like, there's conversations about sampling interpolations. I think it was more of an interpolation, but I think it's a strong enough lift a resemblance that it could have warranted some credit. But I know LCD has a whole methodology of recreating songs, and that's kind of their thing. Um, I, I didn't really expect people to get up in so arms about it. I probably should have, because I kind of was approaching it that way myself. But more so, I was just like, let's give this guy some credit. Like, this dude is this Patrick Keel guy is. I love outsider musicians. That's kind of what Musically Proper is all about. This dude is it. And so that's really why I wanted to talk about him. And it's been awesome to hear, just what you've been able to share about him. But yeah, definitely, he doesn't like he got royalties, doesn't sound like they were direct samples, but this guy was good enough that he could have influenced some of the, best dance songs we've heard in the last 50 years or so. That's just
Well,
kind of my
that's true. Well,
opinion.
let's look at it this way. Again, it's a fine line. I think if you pull 10 musicians over, regardless of genre, rock, jazz, world, whatever, and someone somewhere, especially in the dance realm, be it hip hop, techno, house, drum and bass, in general electronic, or whatever, and someone went out there and utilized a similar pattern or sound. I'm not going to say stole or co-opted or just did.
Mm-hmm.
What is the true nature of how you deal with that? I completely agree that if there was a conscious, sort of a conscious approach on Murphy's part, that he knew exactly what he was doing, by all means, you need to give credit. Maybe it was something where he wasn't aware of where he was getting that riff from. And again, it may have been completely innocent. Who knows? I can name so many examples of musicians who feel flattered by somebody utilizing some small piece of a riff or something they did in their own music, and people who would take great offense to that happening. Now, some examples that come to mind immediately is when Kanye West appropriated the riff from King Crimson's 21st Century Schizoid Man and utilized it in that track that he did. Now, I am not a fan of Kanye West at all. And both personally and professionally, I really detest him, in fact. And apparently Robert Fripp from King Crimson, he found out. Kanye gave him credit. I don't know what happened behind the scenes monetarily. Probably no one will ever know. And apparently he liked what Kanye did. Now, I know other people who were not so happy when that's happened to them.
Yeah.
I know musicians who have sued others for both credit and financial remuneration because of what they did. Where is this fine line between I'm sampling out of respect and admiration and outright theft?
Right.
And I don't know where that line is. And the technology has created a very, very gray area over the many decades in that regard. It's the same thing with what goes on with licensing now, with what goes on with Spotify and Apple Music. The fact that you can just appropriate and do whatever you want. I was when the last time I downloaded a couple of things on Apple Music, I come across that my 2 albums with my friend as Groupthink are available on Apple Music. I did not give them permission to do that. I don't know where they even got it from, but it exists right now on Apple Music, and I've never seen one penny.
Wow.
Now, we're not talking about anything that's certainly going to make me rich. Okay. How many people have downloaded that in the last 10, 15 years? 3 to get what? To get half of 1% of a cent. But that's not really the point. The point is that they had no business doing that without consulting me. They just arbitrarily did it. So now if you've got somebody like Neil Tennant saying, hey, that riff's interesting, let's do our variation of it. It's a really tough thing to call. Art has a tendency to get cannibalized, and it's always been that way. I again never really made. I'd have to play. I know West End Girls very well, and I'd have to play both side by side to really kind of see how it feels to me.
Yeah. I'd love to hear what you think.
It's a tough call.
It is.
I mean, if Patrick didn't take any offense to it and kind of shrugged it off, well, depends on how he approaches his art. Who knows?
I think that's a really good point you make, that it's a hard line to draw because it almost comes down to the motives of the musician, like you talked about. Like, is it out of admiration and respect, or was it like, I'm just going to take this and it's like I came up with it? if it's a motive, you never really will know. You never really will know. And so, but I do 100% agree. Music is art and should be treated like art. And I know that, streaming has kind of taken that aspect away, even iTunes when it first came out. So we definitely agree there as well.
I kind of admire people that run labels now. It's a tough thing to do. Vinyl is insanely expensive now and supposedly going up. The manufacturing costs are ridiculous. I don't know why people refuse to put out multiple format releases. You'll see, like on a typical Bandcamp page, someone will release vinyl and cassette, and they won't put it out on CD.
Yeah.
And the least expensive way to do it is CD. And I'm not. We don't have time to start going into my opinion about vinyl versus compact disc because we'll be on here too long. But yeah, it's all of the things that are involved with running record labels. It's a tough thing to do now because music is now perceived as a commodity that anybody can get for free, and it's almost impossible now to try to really conduct business in that regard and make it viable for both the label itself and for the artist. It's tough to do.
Yeah, it is.
I think basically if you're not doing it as a labor of love, then what are you doing it for?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, I can't thank you enough for having 3 Plus out, that is available for people to hear. I know there's so many people that are grateful for that as well, and I hope there continues to be more downloads of that. When I went and posted about the pool, he had 5,000 monthly listeners on Spotify. I try to purchase as much physical as I can, but I do stream, and
Sure.
he had 5,000 monthly listeners. Now he has close to 18,000 in just over a week, and that's a Dark Entries release on there. I know Dark Entries is working on an archival release of the pool sometime next year. Hopefully a vinyl format. I love that there's a resurgence in the pool, and that you were the first to kind of to make that possible and to bring that to people's ears. So thank you for doing that, and thank you for taking this interview. And I look forward to keeping in touch with you.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time, Justin. I appreciate it too. I'm glad to hear that there is a renewed interest, and I'm glad to share my thoughts on it.